Welcome to Disruptive Conversations. Today we're going to be going into a topic that's a very important part of life, which has to do with mourning and grief and what that looks like. It's part of everyone's life. It's something that we're all going to be experiencing. And so our question is, how do we navigate this? Today my guest is going to be Meghan Riordan Jarvis, and waiting for Meghan to come on. She requested already. We're going to buffer for a moment and Instagram Live or with anything else in life as things go. So waiting for Meghan to come on.
Hello.
And here she is. So Meghan, at this point, what's going to happen is that I am going to introduce the show, and then I'm going to introduce you, and we are going to be on the move. So everyone, welcome to Disruptive Conversations with entrepreneurs, innovators, thought leaders, authors, educators, in which we deep dive into the experiences these women have needed to navigate and conquer in order to achieve their personal and professional success. I'm Dr. Risa Ryger. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am an expert in change. I help people make positive change at any point in time, and we're all built for change. In order to make positive change, we need to disrupt. So we need to disrupt a thought, a feeling, a belief, a habit, a behavior in order to create our 10.0 lives. And that's what this series of conversations is all about. And today I am delighted to have Meghan Riordan Jarvis on board to talk with us about a topic that she has both experienced personally and has put a great deal of thought and effort into, and has brought it into greater space in the world. So I'm going to read you her bio because I can't put this into memory. So Meghan is an author, podcast host, TEDx speaker who specializes in grief and loss. She experienced PTSD following the deaths of both her parents within 2 years of one another. And she began speaking on a larger scale about the importance of understanding loss, grief, and how do we support someone who's grieving. And grief is something that not only happens in our personal lives, but we also take with us and in our entering the workplace. And so it behooves the people in the workspace to understand what the effects of grief and grieving can have on the job. And she is also an author of The End of the Hour, publishing with Zibby Books, which is going to be coming out in November. I take my hat and as many hats as I have, and I do have many, off to you. I'm in the process myself right now. And so Meghan, I know this is a topic that oftentimes people go, oh, this is a show about grief and grieving. And so how do I go into this? So first of all, I'd like to ask you what it is that I haven't mentioned about you that you would like people to know.
I think the topic of grief and loss makes it sound sad and hard. And I actually think it is intimate and holy. So it's not in my bio, but like I laugh a lot and really enjoy my life. And that even though I had PTSD and I live with PTSD, I'm really passionate about helping people feel hopeful about the concept of learning how to grieve, both sort of from an educated standpoint. You know, we act as though we can't teach people about what the body does, but human bodies are pretty universal, and we can actually teach people about what to expect to happen to their systems so they feel less crazy. So that's it. Just, I love it, and I love it because it's actually it's incredibly needed. We're all going to grieve, and I think I like being a hope merchant. I like being someone who says it's really hard, but you can do it.
Absolutely. So one question is, what is it that you needed to disrupt in yourself? Because we're talking about disruption, certainly loss and is a disruption, but what is it that you needed to disrupt within yourself in order to be able to take the steps that you've taken and be in this space of
Oh, it's such a
success at
good
this point in
question.
time for you?
What I have had to do, I love the concept of change around the theme of grief and loss. And I love the idea of thinking of it as a disruption, right? Because there's so much potential in disruption. What happened for me, as someone who was an educator and passionate about grief and loss, even before I experienced my own really profound loss, which happened with the death of my mom, what happened for me is I sort of thought I had a relatively predictable path ahead of me. You know, we like that
Mm,
as creatures who are trying to navigate difficult spaces. The brain is essentially a predictive tool. So it doesn't love novelty and change. Even though we're wired to do it, it would prefer routine. And so what really was the ultimate disruption for me was my mother's death. But being able to see that as sort of like, okay, a meteor just hit the path that I'm on. I actually have the
yes.
potential to do, in brain science, we say novelty. I can do new things. It's just unbelievably hard because I can't pull up any of the past experiences and say, oh, we'll just apply this the way we would a coat or an outfit. Oh, I know what to wear to that. I had to invent those new things. And so for me, part of that was writing. I've been a talk therapist and a body-centered therapist for a long time. I love those modalities. And after I got treatment for PTSD symptoms, I didn't want to talk about my feelings. And I didn't really have more physical processing to do of the emotions at that time. So I started journaling. And I mean, there are days when I don't write, but they are very infrequent. I have filled hundreds of I have it here, like my perfect little notebook filled with notes. And that is a new thing. And I have to say, it's really exciting. I'm 49. I was 45 when my mom died. It's pretty exciting at 45 just to grow a whole new part of yourself, even if it's torturous, which it was.
Mhm. Well, it's through disruption, and that's often what happens, that there's something, this is something that's clear, that we can clearly point to. And just to let you know, I think I might have mentioned it, but to also let people in our community know that I was a consulting psychologist for victim services for New York. And that, when people are going through grief, loss, and there's the type that's anticipated to some extent, and there's the kind that's absolutely not anticipated, right? That nevertheless, we still have to, what do we do with all of that? I'm also thinking and sending my thoughts to people in Morocco who have experienced, talk about an unexpected loss, people in Libya who've experienced unexpected loss, that we experience unexpected loss, whether it's for ourselves and for a greater population. And it brings us to the space of, where's the us and them? I know there's a lot I'm throwing in here of when, and so I think that, and when it comes to grieving, that there can be so many different ways of grieving, and that how do we allow for these differences? So if it isn't exactly what we say it should be, or we say it should be like, whoever the we is or are at that moment in time, how do we allow for the individual, how someone
That's such a perfect
metabolizes
question.
that?
And what I sometimes get, on the DMs or in my email box is like, look, Megan, it's not possible to teach anybody anything about grief because it's totally personal. And I appreciate that concept, but our nutritional choices are also totally personal, and we teach nutrition. how we work out and what we do with our muscle systems of our body, we can also teach that. How you might organize numbers in your head is totally personal, but I can teach you some math skills. So what you're distinguishing between is sort of how the concept of what makes grief difficult. And we have some factors. So what is it or who is it that you lost? So someone who is closer to the center is going to be more difficult for your system. How did you, right? So my 99-year-old grandfather dying in his sleep is a different kind of loss than my 23-year-old son, you know, dying of an overdose. So how did you lose them? And then what is the state of your current being? How are you when that loss takes place? What's going on in your life? You know, I've worked with people who are brand new mothers when their own mother dies. That's different than being 71 when your mother dies. And so, you know, what's going on, and also what existed in your life previous. So what sort of traumas, what past history with loss maybe still lingers like a splinter? Because the reality is we process loss through our bodies, and it's really our, you know, we have 12 major systems in the body, but the central nervous system.
Yeah.
The central nervous system is the one that navigates whether or not we kind of stay regulated. And so when people are saying, well, like my loss was harder than their loss, or, you know, we try not to compare losses. What we say is, what was the hit to your system? And certainly the image I always use is, you know, when my father died, it was like every week I would go see him on a Saturday, and I would kind of have a little cup of grief and a little cup of death and a little cup of loss. But it didn't make me sick. It wasn't too much. I could take it in, and I sort of chose it because I was, you know, going to see him. My mother died in her sleep unexpectedly, and that was like choking down a gallon of water in 1 second. And it did make the rest of my system sick. It was too much for me to take in, and there were other ramifications to that. So when we're helping people navigate it, that's what we're identifying first, is how is your system doing? Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Do you have thoughts running in your head? And then really what we do is we go in and we help with that disruption to the central nervous system first. And then kind of learning to live with grief over time comes after that. It's a bit like having been thrown overboard. We're not going to talk about how do you feel about being thrown overboard while you're still swimming. We wait until you're dry and warm, and we say, boy, that was a scary process.
Yeah. And that there's something, I think that there's some notion of that you should be over it. Like there's some sort of prescriptive time that you should be over it. And that there's, I don't know if this is terminology, you know, one of the things I love about doing this show is as I'm talking to people, things, you know, things happen.
Sure.
It's like the magic of being in connection. And that this grief, that there's an element of grief shaming, as if you're doing it wrong, you should be done with it already, that if you haven't, that if you're not just celebrating someone's life, you're not in the celebratory mode. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's wonderful. But that there isn't just one way, but that if you're not in certain places and showing certain kinds of behaviors and language, that you're doing it wrong, that you're behind, and that you're in a space of grief shaming where people are kind of looking at you sideways and going like, why aren't they done
I
with this
think
yet?
I think if we pulled a whole bunch of grievers and a whole bunch of supporters in a room together, you would not get a single narrative about whether or not people were being supported or feeling supported. But I think every supporter out there, everyone who loves someone who is grieving, believes that they are being supportive. So I think there's a couple of things happening. One is we do not have core grief education. So qualitatively, when I talk to my clients, I ask them, and this is hundreds of people, how long do you think it's supposed to take to grieve someone? And almost universally, I hear about a year. And that is not, there's no data that says anything about that. So if you yourself as the griever think it's supposed to take a year, that is the expectation that we're operating with. We also have a diagnosis that's in our statistical manual now that says if after a year you are still having feelings of yearning and other things, you may have pathological grief. And that also, both of these things don't do us any good, because the reality is, I think there are many people who have the kind of grief that is going to require some treatment to move the energy through their system. It's too heavy and they're going to need some hands lifting. I think that grief can exist. It did for me. I just happened to be so well educated that when it happened, I knew what it was and I knew to immediately get. But that was within the first 5 hours of my mother's death. I had ruminations that I knew were not going to go away on their own because of my clinical experience. Now, most of my clients wait an entire year. So what's difficult for supporters is they don't know anything. They're not clinically savvy. But one, we don't love seeing people that we love struggle. You know, it's the same with depression. We don't love it. We wish it would stop. The way that I want to love you is to make it stop. And sometimes you're on the receiving end of me saying, boy, I really think this is wrong. It shouldn't be this hard. And what you hear is you're doing it wrong because it's so hard. But, you know, a lot of the grief education that I do kind of starts with, this is when we define it as pathological. And I'll just say this for the people who are listening, that to me as a clinician, if your symptoms are getting significantly worse and not better, you are not sleeping more, you are sleeping less. You are not feeling less guilty, you are feeling more guilty. You are not able to eat, you have more distress in your digestion, your muscle tone is different. All of those things, you're noticing that your taste buds are shifting, you're more irritable with people. If that seems to be increasing instead of decreasing, just go talk to a clinician and let them tell you what's going on with you. They might say, hey, it's totally normal. But if you have symptoms that are increasing, let's say about 3 months after a loss, you deserve to be supported. And what I hear from grievers a lot is, should I go see a doctor? And I will tell you, I live in a household where if someone's elbow hurts them a little bit, because they played tennis yesterday, they have already made it a doctor's appointment to go check because they don't want to do any more damage to their elbow. So every time someone says to me, well, should I? Or I'm really offended because my mother thinks I should go see a professional. What I say is, but there's help in the rooms of professionals. Aren't we all entitled to help? If we haven't been educated about what grief is, what the symptoms are, or how to move it through our bodies or navigate it, we probably do need more help. So that, I think the grief shaming comes in when people are feeling really isolated and alone and don't know what to do with their loss. And so do their loved ones. They feel confused and don't know what to tell you to do. And everybody feels stuck. And all of a sudden, I feel like I'm the problem. I can't get over this. It's been 4 months. Why am I still crying? I mean, my DMs are really heartbreaking. People are on the receiving end of such ignorance. And I don't believe it's because people are cruel. I think it's because they don't understand.
Absolutely. People don't understand. We haven't, there's so much that isn't part of our educational work. And so here, I'm just going to do a little, aside for our community, which is that, as children, we're taught about the ABCs or the 3 R's, but we're not taught about the apostrophe S, which is self. We're missing that piece. We're missing the piece about how do we mourn and how do we mourn? How do we grieve? And depending on what the models were in your family, there are some families that navigate mourning and grief in one way. Other families, it's like not to be talked about. There's all sorts of messaging about that. And that, again, to your point, which I think is so important, is that if it can show up on an X-ray, it can be looked at with blood work, or you can have an MRI of it, then that's something that one should do. But there's a very different kind of standard, and sometimes the standard of I'm not strong enough, I should be able to do this, when it comes to our emotional and mental well-being, as if that's something that is out of the realm of, you, if you had pneumonia, you shouldn't be able to cure your own pneumonia. And right. And yet when it comes to loss and grieving, that we should just know how to do it and just be able to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm putting a lot of justs in very specifically because it's diminutive. It kind of softens it up, but that somehow we should intuitively know how to do it. And that
I
is a
look to
disservice.
leaders in this space too. I do a lot of corporate work, and what I say to folks is it's a bit like your employee has a concussion. You know, in terms of what's going on inside the brain, concussions for some people, they hit their head really hard and their brain recovered and they're doing fine, but there's still a protocol. We watch them for a month and we say, don't do this and do that. The brain and the body takes such a hit, and we have so much neuroscience that says things like abilities to do multi-stepped instructions are compromised. Your memory is compromised. Anyone who has grieved significantly has some story of like putting their car keys down and not being able to find them for months. I threw my American Express card away so many times after my mother died that I still can't get one because I think they thought I was selling them on the black market. I just would take the receipt, take their credit card, and throw it away. We know enough, and leaders need to take that into consideration because it's not good for your company. It's not good for your hospital. It's not good for your congregation to behave as though that person just goes to their therapist for an hour, gets their head all rubbed and fixed and polished up. They get a Band-Aid and then they come back into the world, where they've only had 3 days of bereavement leave. So they're back in their workplace and, they're just a little sad sometimes. The sadness is not the problem. People actually have been sad many times in their lives. They can navigate that. What overwhelms the system is we start to wonder, what does life even mean? Am I doing the right things with my life? On top of not being able to sleep, not being able to eat, So I think part of it is who's going to take the lead to help us actually educate folks to understand that, one, it is actually a very personal experience. So you do have to create, I always with my clients equate it to having a sex life. You have to create your own experience of what is good for you in your body. And it may be nothing like your sisters or your best friends, but borrowing your sisters or your best friends, maybe their idea or the conversations they've had with it might be a good start if you have no idea what to do. So for most grievers, there's almost this like Sherlock Holmes experimentation. And I have in my office a really big whiteboard just covered with words, things that grievers have told me helps them with their grief. Everything from planting flowers to bicycling to cooking to crying to doing gymnastics. And I say, if any of these things feel possible, let's try them. And if you come up with anything new, I'll put it on the board. And just that is like a little bit of a motivation for people to think outside, like what might help me? What might feel good? But most of us have never had those conversations before until we are in the thick of it. And it's pretty hard. The part of our brain that needs to be creative and curious and approach novelty with experimentation is actually pretty cut off by our limbic system's response. So if we can have some education in a class and a conversation beforehand, and you think, oh, I bet I'd be somebody who would like to do, I bet I'd be an exerciser. I bet I'd like art if I really needed to be in my feelings. And you have that sort of primed and prepped for when that experience happens. You're still going to have to approach the novelty and the disruption to your life and learn and grow, but maybe you can do it with a little more confidence and a little less terror and a little less feeling like you're the first person in the whole world that's had to do it because no one's ever talked to you about it before.
Yes. And I found that also, as a clinical psychologist, that when I've had parents of children of all different ages come in because there has been a loss in the family and they don't know how to do this for their children and with their children, that being able to create a model, a way of how we talk about it, what we do, different rituals, how we go about, allowing for feelings, that it is that oftentimes in the service of trying to do it for their children, that it emerges what they have had for themselves, what they feel that that is missing for themselves. And as a family, they develop these new ways that are very, very personal. And whether it is annually, because we're talking years and we mark anniversaries, it's part of our cultural piece, is that they plant a tree or make a donation to something, or they look at a photo album, that there are all these different ways of doing it. And one more thing, and I'd love your thoughts on this, which is that also it's not necessary that
Oh,
it's all over, that you just stop feeling that, and that you can have moments where you'll smell something and it'll remind you of. You'll smell something, you'll hear a joke that somebody would have liked. Something happens and you wish at that
yeah.
moment that you could just share it. And that we can live in a duality of being okay and getting to the point of being okay, which doesn't mean that we're not missing people at times. We're not wishing, hey, I know I feel that they're with me, but I would sure love to say, if you tasted this, you would have loved it. We're having this happy occasion and you would have loved this. And that's a continual piece of life, that
That's
we don't have
well,
amnesia
and I think
about
so
people.
in the sort of grief theory world, there's a theory called continuing bonds. And the idea of that is you sort of transfer what was a living relationship into a relationship that, however you want to say it, it's a relationship with a memory, it's a relationship with a spiritual realm, but it's exactly what you're describing, which is sort of, when you want to share the food with someone, you pause and you feel them in that moment, and then you are in the relationship with them in that moment. And it helps, I think, a little bit. I think it's tricky. I find it hard personally. But I think part of it is you don't just feel the pain of missing them. Oh God, I wish you were here to taste this clam
Mm-hmm.
chowder. But also you pivot a little to, like, you would have loved it. God, you loved clam chowder. And so it allows a little bit of that movement off the edge of pain into, God, it was so, remember that time we went to that place and we had that clam chowder. And now I'm more in the joy of what made you so important to me and why it's so hard to live without you. The other thing that I'll say about kids is kids do not have a lot of the garbage that adults have about whether it's okay to grieve. Kids understand that sad things are sad. They can be very confused by adults who do not grieve in front of them, but their instincts are to be sad about sad things. And when you talk to children about wanting to create a ritual, we're going to have our third Christmas without dad. Can we sit down and think, how do we want to think about him? Of course we'll be sad, but we don't want to only be sad. And I have this beautiful story that I'll share with your team. A young widow, her kids were 4 and 6. When her husband died, they were on the second anniversary. She was finding it much harder than the first, which many people do. And she asked her kids, should we go to grandma's house to have this holiday? They wanted to go. And she said, well, I think I'm going to be really sad that dad isn't there. Maybe we can think about something that we could do. And her husband, she had moved all of his clothes into the garage, but hadn't gotten rid of them. And the older of her two children, the day that they were headed to grandma's Christmas, and they hadn't really come up with a plan, they talked about it, went out and collected the father's baseball hats. And he brought one for everyone. And brought them to the dinner, and everyone wore a hat from the dad and told a story about, where they had been with him and that wasn't the child's intention, but it was the invitation, right? To be in the pain, but
Yes.
also be in the love.
Yes, and to share the happy, to share the
That's
laughter, to share the wink, and
yeah.
that's and to continue the twinkle that happens in relationship. So unfortunately, I
Right.
knew this was going to happen, Megan, and it did, which is that, you blink and it's half an hour. And I thank you so very much for coming on and sharing this really important information about a topic that can be hard to talk about, but it doesn't mean that it's untalkable. It means that you feel uncomfortable and you get in there, and it's for your good, the good of those around you. And so I just want to let people know that your book is coming out in November, and not to miss that, and that people can find you on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and we have all sorts of other areas, and that if you forever, for whatever reason, if unfortunately you miss this live, fear not, that I will be posting it, Meghan will be posting it, and so tell your friends, tell the people that you know who need to hear this, to listen, to take it in for yourself, that you can go back, you can hear it. Follow Meghan. If you haven't followed me, please follow me also on Instagram, and I'm always dropping important information to help you, because positive change can happen at any point. And go find your disruption to help make your life more of what you wish it would be. So
Yeah.
Meghan, thank you so very much. And let's take our hair, go to your hair flip, and so that we can post it
Good.
well. All right, so whenever you're ready. And one more.
Thank,
Thank you so much. This is our first time, but not our last time
thank
together. And until then,
you, buddy.
thanks everyone. See you soon.